I'm not seeing the.
I went ahead and did it, Mike.
Okay, good. So here you can see some of the bird guides. You can see some I laid down a table, some of the main ones I like. This Kaufman one's a good one. Here's the Birds of Willamette Valley, good local one. Here's one more for the Pacific Northwest. So basically you can break them into general guides where they have all the birds of an area like North America or Western North America. You've got the ones like for a certain geographic area like the Pacific Northwest or Arizona, New Mexico. You have some that are even further divided into like the Willamette Valley or Northern California. And then you also have some like this one where it's just a birds of like birds of prey, for example. This, they have warbler guides and ones on individual families of birds. And so that's how sort of they're. Also, one of my favorite ones for doing research is up here, the Sibley Birds one is the bigger one. The second edition is a pretty good one. You can see all the, I'll move this up out of the way. But you can see all my bookcase, all the bird guides I have, and this isn't all of them, as I was telling Tim. But before we get started too far here, I have a poll here, and we'll go ahead and take a poll and get some answers to some questions here. So here's the poll. We'll leave it on for a few minutes. Go ahead and answer those. They're all anonymous. Pretty simple. Do you have a field guide? How many field guides do you own? And if you own a field guide, what's your favorite field guide? We've got 6 out of 7 people so far. We'll give it another half minute, see if the other person wants to chime in. And there, I think we have all 7. So, do you have a field guide? 100% said they do own a field guide. How many field guides do you have? 71% said 1 to 3. One person said 4 to 5, and another person said more than 10. And 3 said they like Sibley. And 3 said they like birds of the Willamette Valley region. And 1 said other. Okay, real good. So we'll get rid of the poll. So generally speaking, I don't think you can have too many guides because each one's different, as we'll get into each of them. And bird guides to me are similar to optics. You know, you can buy a scope or binoculars. There's a lot of choices, like in binoculars, Zeiss, Swarovski, Nikon, Vortex. They're all pretty much the same in that they do pretty much the same thing, but each of them look different. They feel different. You can feel next to your eye that they feel different. The same with birding guides. The layout can be different. Of course, the size can be different. So to me, the biggest difference here, the biggest key to field guides and optics for that matter, is preference. Is mainly your preference and no one else's. because the bird book or optics are for you, so they have to be able to work for you. A guide needs to fit your needs and your preferences. For optics, for example, you want one that easily fits into your hands, while with a field guide, you want something that looks good and that's easy to use, that you can easily thumb through it and get to the birds that you want to see. A question I get a lot is, well, what is the best bird guide? Well, my answer to that is it depends. A lot goes into it. It's mainly, as we said, I'll focus on this a lot throughout the presentation. It's your preference. I naturally have my favorites, and we'll talk about some of those today, but there's a lot to consider, such as size, the local, regional, or national ones that cover all over the U.S. or just regional or local. There are specific family ones on raptors, hummingbirds, woodpeckers, warblers, the list goes on. But a key consideration, I think, is how it's set up, whether it's in taxonomic order, color coded, and most likely to be seen in the area. So those are some of the things to consider. See if I can get. So here are some considerations we'll talk about. We'll discuss how you can discover the best guides. First consideration, reference at home or in the field. How are you going to use the guide? So let's go into that. So size is important in this. You don't want to be carrying a big, huge encyclopedia type one like this one here. It's hard to see it, but here's the big Sibley one. And it's pretty heavy and large. It is like an encyclopedia or dictionary. And so likely you aren't going to be carrying that with you in the field. Whereas, as many of you have said, one of your favorite ones is this Birds of the Willamette Valley. It's a good one for a local one and pretty easy to use. There are good reasons to carry a guide. Personally, I don't. I use the guides on my phone when I need them. But I think, again, it's a person's preference, whether you like carrying a guide. I like to focus on birds and nature. So I try not to go to my guide too much. We'll go into that a little further later on. Another one is the amount of information in the guide. Some considerations are the number of birds that are covered. In the bigger guides, lots of birds are covered, whereas in the nice ones like this next one that I have, like the Birds of the Willamette Valley here, or for that matter, the small little guide, it's hard to see. Not having much luck in seeing it, but this title, Beginner's Guide to Birds by Stokes, the Western region, is a nice little book, and you can see here the gives the essential clues. It shows, it gives a short little description of the bird. Usually it only has one photo of the bird, and usually it's the male and breeding plumage. That can be a drawback because, as we all know, that birds aren't always in breeding plumage. But it has its place as far as guides go. Now here's a little more complete guide. You can see where on Scott's Oriole, it gives the identification, the size. It has a range map here. It gives its feeding, breeding, and other behavior, the habitat that you might find it in, the voice. So there's a lot of information here, including several different photos, including the one of the female and the male, etc. So that's one thing to take in consideration too, is the amount of information and how much information you want. And each, one thing when you're looking at the bird guides, each author has their own way and own approach to the birds and how to set them out in a different manner. And we'll see some of those examples here in a second. And here's one of them, photos or drawings. Would you rather have a book with photos or ones with drawings? For example, here, this is the Kaufman book, and he uses photographs, where on the left side, right side here, these are drawings, and they're in the Sibley book. Of course, Sibley is a real good artist and is known for his art. So his preference is to actually draw each individual bird and taking into consideration the descriptions to give the best model of the bird possible. While Kaufman, on the other hand, thinks photos is a way to go. He has quite a few different photos, but the one thing about photos, it only captures one time, a spot in time. And so the molting could be different on it. Some of the spotting could be different. And of course, in drawings, you can't get everything either, but they can make the bird look more like you might see it most of the time. Drawings can really show field marks a little better. For example, photos usually show the best quality that you would see the bird and not necessarily what you would actually see out in the field. Stokes also uses photos. Of course, Mrs. Stokes, Lillian, is an excellent photographer. And so that goes to some of the preferences that different authors have based on their own knowledge and expertise. Next thing is ease of use. Before I bought any book, I would, of course, this again depends on your preference. National Audubon has a guide. I'm going to get down here to it. One of the old field guides here. You can sort of see a red old field guide. It was in the 1980s. But one thing I definitely don't like about this book is that here in the front, it gives you some information here about the birds and where you can find them. Okay, page such and such gives a description of the bird. You go to 66, and then it says, oh, well, then you have to go back to page 159 to see a photo of it. So here you are going back and forth to see a photo of the bird versus a description of it. And so to me, that isn't very user-friendly. Kaufman has a different setup in his books. In fact, it's hard to see this. Let's see if I can get it. But actually what he does, he has a pictorial table of contents where he breaks out the birds like ducks, geese, and swans, other swimming birds, aerial water birds. You go down to chicken-like birds, wading birds, medium-sized land birds. That includes like doves and pigeons. Then he goes on to flycatchers, typical songbirds, like say your robin. So that's another different way to distinguish by how the authors sort of make their books and how each one is different. And after a time, you'll sort of see your own style and figure out your own style, which ones you like the best. Another example here is some go by color. I've got such a stack of books here, but for example, One easy one to use is what I mentioned before, the Beginner's Guide to Birds by Stokes here along the edge here. Is not, there we go. You can see the colors along the edge, not, there we go. And so it's based on colors. You can go to the one tab here. Here's yellow. All the birds are yellow, like your goldfinches. You can go to red and see the house finch, Bolox Oreo, and some of the other ones. You can go to brown and see the sparrows. So there are 3 different ways that the authors make up their books, and some of these books are geared towards beginners, others towards intermediate, or just users in general. Next, we'll get to the range maps, and so how it's laid out, taxonomic order. Some of them are, starting out with the ducks and waterfowl, and then working their way all the way back through blackbirds. Also, some of them, for example, the Peterson guide, all of his range maps are in the back of the book, where most of your guides, including Sibley and National Geographic, they have the maps and range maps right in with the description. I like them like this personally, when the range map is right with the descriptions, so you don't have to go back and say, "Oh, is this the time of the year for them, or are they seen here?" It's right there in front of you when you're reading the description. Here's where I talked about how they're laid out. And here's the example of the Stokes book. Formatting here is by color. White birds, birds that are all white, like your great egret and stuff would be here. Birds are black and white. And so you can sort of see how this one is set up. And this is the Stokes Beginner's Guide. And also some of the bird books, the layout and format might be more aesthetically pleasing to you and your eye. So that's why I say when you're going to buy a bird book, go to a store that has quite a few bird books, so you can actually look at them and get a feel, touch and feel them, and open them up. And I like to go through and say, take American Robin or Red-tailed Hawk and go to each book and look at that a bird species and see how they treat it and what information they give on it. Also, in the front of the guide, the guides are set up differently. Sibley gives a key to the species accounts, goes into group accounts, and at the beginning, we'll go over this a little more. At the beginning, it gives an introduction to subspecies, the classification of birds, how to learn to identify birds, about habitat, geographic and variation between birds, how to learn their songs and calls, finding rare birds, bird topography, which I think is very important, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It really helps if you can, when you're describing a bird to someone, say, "Oh, you need help in describe to ID a bird," and you send somebody a description. It's a lot more helpful to say it was all white in its secondaries, or its gorget was purple. Here's the example that I was giving in the Peterson books, where that was a Kaufman book, where he uses aerial birds and swimming birds, chicken-like birds. And here's another book where when I talked about taxonomical order, here it is, like ducks. Down further, there's hummingbirds. You go down further, you get into the loons, storks. Keep going now, kingfisher, woodpeckers. We go over here to the right, nuthatches. Here's the warblers. Get into your starlings. Here's your sparrows, and then blackbirds are the last one. So this is what we call taxonomic or order. Now, the last thing as far as considerations for the guides that I take in consideration is how it describes the songs or calls. Of course, the songs and calls are really important because, as we know, when you're out there birding, many times, sometimes up to 75 or 80% of the time, you don't see the bird, and all you have is to rely on the song or call. So I think it's pretty important is how each guide treats the song or call. For example, on this one on the left, can't remember which book this was, but you can see how it describes the voice. It does mention how close the Bewick's wren is to song sparrow. It describes it, high, thin, buzz, and warble. Calls include a flat, hollow jip. But look at it here in this other book when you compare it. Song suggests song sparrows, but it gives a further description of how it differs from the song sparrow. It's thinner, starting on 2 or 3 high notes, dropping lower and ending on a thin trill. Calls sharp bit, vit, and buzzy d's. So the book here on the right gives a little bit more information on the voice than the book on the left. Some books even include a sonogram on it, and that's a little chart that sort of shows you the up and downs of the call and the variation in the call. But the bottom line, the description of the song or call, I think, in a guide is a necessity in a guide. Now, what are some good field guides? Well, I'm just going to give some general pointers here because, as we said, it's preference, preference, preference. But I think it's good in a guide to compare species, have detailed range maps. We'll go into that a little bit later, but it's important to have detailed range maps. I think it's important too that it talks about its behavior because a lot of birds can be, behavior is a real good indicator of what bird it is. And also one that mentions habitat because all those things help you narrow down the bird. For example, as far as comparing species, for example, between ruby-crowned kinglet and Hutton's vireo, does it say that these are closely related species and give a comparison to how they're different? If you go back here, this talks about the habitat. It does give similar species, like some Carolina wrens have limited buff below and are similar to them. So I think it's good to have that comparison in there. And let's see, what else can we say about this? Behavior, as far as talking about behavior, Sibley is one of the best ones, I think, the Sibley guides, even the smaller one that talks about behavior. For example, let me pick one out here. Get down, here we go. Okay, so here what Sibley says about beaver's wren. It gives the size and everything. It says common in many dense, brushy habitats, from mesquite thickets to chaparral to riparian willows and openings in coniferous forests. And then it says larger and more slender than house wren, with longer tail, often flecked and fanned. So here it gives you quite a bit about the habitat, comparing it to a house wren and mentioning that it flecks its tail and fans its tail. And then it gives a description of the call. So basically it talks about behavior, habitat, and it compares the species. And it also has a range map, so it hits on all of those key characteristics. Now, this probably won't come through, but in some of the old guides, in the new ones, mainly it gives a range map, but in one of these older guides, it's a golden field guide. I liked it where I'll see if you can see this is, and maybe I have a photo here of it, but you can see on here that it has some little lines on it across the map. And what that is periods of time during migration. They'll say by April 1st, it will be here. By May 1st, it will be here. And by June 1st, it will be here. And it's sort of nice to have that sort of, you can expect it range of times of when a bird will arrive in the area. In fact, here it is. You can see it here better. So the first solid line arrives here March 1st. This dotted line arrives April, May, June, and this one extended summer range around here. Sometimes here's a main summer range, but then it can extend a little further to the north and west. So I like that. Here's your typical range map, which isn't bad by any stretch of imagination. But just looking at this, do we know what these really mean? Some of you might know what they mean, but that's one of the important things that we'll talk about in a little bit of why it's important to read the first part of your book and the first part of the guide and get familiar with that first part of the guide. I like to continue to, it's interesting here, I got off thought here, but a question mark here. I haven't seen that too often on range map where they think it might go up into northwestern Montana. But I think range maps are really important because it gives you good help in knowing where the bird is being seen, when it's seen, and whether it's during migration or what winter, summer, this is migration. Also, some of the ranges change over time. For example, the Eurasian collared dove, it came from the Bahamas and came first to the Florida back in the 80s. And so the early maps in the 80s only had the Eurasian collared dove showing here. Well, as we know, now it has spread northward and westward, and now it's in Oregon and all over here. So if you had an old guide, it would just show them being only in Florida. But now the new guide shows them all over the US. Another example of a change in range maps would be there's 12 duck species, including northern pintail, northern shoveler. They're more common during the winter in the north now, but they are stable or declining in the south. So now in some of the guides are showing that, you know, some of those ducks are staying further north now. So my favorite field guides, here's sort of a stack of the field guides that I like. But having said that, there is no perfect field guide that I know of. That's why I think they have so many field guides, because each one's different based on the author's perspective and people's preferences. So locally, I like this Birds of Willamette Valley. For a smaller book that you could take in the field, the Sibley Field Guide to Birds of Western North America is a nice little field guide. This one's a little bit bigger, but fairly new, only a couple years old. Birds of the Pacific Northwest for a Regional Guide by John Shuey and Tim Blunt. Tim used to be over at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, now resides in Arizona. I do like the National Geographic Field Guide to Birds of North America. I really like it for waterfowl in particular. This is a fairly new book, less than a year old, Peterson Field Guide to Birds. And then down below here, I have the Sibley Guide to Birds. This is a big one that's like an encyclopedia, second edition, can do all kinds of research in it. It's sort of my go-to guide when I have want more deep details on a bird, or say I'm going someplace and I want to research birds before I go to a new location. This Sibley Guide really gets into the details and pretty comprehensive and detailed. Red-tailed hawk, for example, has 2 pages on it. Some guides only have 1 page or a half a page on it. Peterson, this is a pretty portable one too, is another reason why I like it. So now let's go to talk about using a field guide. So when you're out in the field, what I like to do when I do bring my field guide along, so I see a bird in the field, don't take your eyes off the bird. Keep your focus on the bird and focus mentally on the bird. Look at the head and work your way back to the tail. And then think to yourself of the habitat it's in, what behavior is it doing, the shape, the time of year, if it's giving a call, and if need be, initially have a little notebook with you and take some notes, if it's a new or unusual bird, and so that you can recall the field marks and the other details about the bird. That way you'll be able to better describe it or look it up later on. And then when it flies off, watch it fly off and watch how it flies away. Is it undulating flight? Is it a fairly direct flight? And those kinds of things. Note the flight pattern. So then once that's all done, the bird's gone, now you can pick up your field guide and start to look for the bird. And the first thing I do is, okay, try to put it in a family. Like, was this a sparrow? Was it a wren? Was it a dove or a raptor, for example? So then that way I know, okay, this was very sparrow-like. So then I know to go to my sparrows part and start looking at it. So that's sort of how I approach it. Now, it's nice to have the most recent field guide. Of course it is, and that's why I have so many field guides, and my bookcase is just full of so many. In fact, I just bought one the other day. Audubon just came out with a brand new Birds of North America. This is a huge book. There it is. I mean, this is even bigger than the Sibley Birds one. A complete guide to birding with full color photographs, updated range maps, and authoritative notes on voice, behavior, habitat, nesting, and conservation status. I mean, I've been into this book a little bit because it's so new, but so far I'm really impressed with it. It's fairly expensive in the $40 range, but I got it through Amazon, and believe it or not, it's less than a month old. So why get the new guides? Well, as we talked about, things change over time. Like some of the old ones, if you had an old one from the 80s or even early 90s, you'd look in your book and it'd say Rufuside Towhee, and you'd just go out in the field and start saying, oh, there's a Rufuside Towhee. Well, it's been split, and now it's an Eastern Towhee and Spotted Towhee. So they update almost every year. There's changes by the American Ornithological Union, and they make these different changes in birds. Some are lumped together and some are split out and made into two species like the towhee was. And as we talked about earlier, range maps change. The Eurasian collared dove has really expanded. Some birds, their range starts to narrow. Family or genus could change. For example, just this past year, the northwestern crow has been lumped in with the American crow. So there's no longer the northwestern crow up in Washington. So we lost a species there. There can be new species discovered. And also the song or call can change, or can be better defined, the call. Maybe, for example, the Bewick's wrens, many of these birds have 15 to 20 different calls or songs. And so the book may describe one or two of them, but then over a period of time, as the bird gets a little older and the species generates into further down, I forget the biological thing we'd call that, but anyway, the voice may change a little bit, or some calls or songs may become more prevalent than they were before, so they might replace a song or a call, for example. Last but not least, this is one of the main reasons for why I wanted to have this class too, is so many people, when they get their bird guide, the first thing they do is open up and they start going to birds. I want to look at sparrows. I want to look at the hawks. Oh, there's the nuthatches, and get all excited. Oh, here's the warblers. And here, they don't spend any time in the front part of the book. I think one of the main things to do is when you first get the book is don't ignore these front pages in the book. Look at the entire field guide. Like I was describing before, each book is set up differently, some by colors, some by the family of birds, some taxonomical order. And if you don't look at the front, you won't know how it's set up. In addition, some of these, for example, the range maps, some use different colors. Most of the time, summer is sort of a rusty color, red or something like that for summer, where winter is blue and migration is usually yellow. But many times, some authors use different colors to describe the range maps. So it's important to look in the front of the book. Also, you can learn a lot about, here Sibley has about variation in experience, what polymorphism is, the wearing and fading of feathers, the change of the posture, deformities in birds, describing habitats. And one thing I pay particular attention to is the bird topography, and that is the parts of the bird. Like what's the nape, the crown of the bird. Of course, we all know what the bill is and probably know the breast, etc. But, you know, and we know the belly, but the tail, no rectrices, and how the number of the tail feathers are numbered, and little things like that. And believe it or not, the parts of the bird are different. A songbird is different than the parts for a duck or for a gull or for a raptor. And so sort of just look those over and try to just think of those things as you're, it doesn't mean you have to go and study and become, an expert right away, but over a period of time, look at that from a book and refresh your memory. It'll help you in the long run. But like we said, it shows you how the guide set up, the color coding that uses, and other important information on the biology and stuff of birds. So I didn't mention them in this course, but birding apps, there's quite a few birding apps out there, and I had a separate course on that, and I'll probably eventually do it again, but there's like iBird Pro, Sibley Birds, Audubon Birds has a free app. I really like Raptor ID. That's a free app. Also, you could download Merlin ID. That's a free app from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And of course, there's eBird. That's a good app too. So there's quite a few different good apps out there that you get just to put on your phone. Where to buy the field guides? Well, Salem Audubon sells a lot of these local guides, the regional ones and local ones. Not sure right now with COVID how you would set up that sale, but maybe Tim later will have some guidance on that. But also probably the best place in Salem is Wild Birds Unlimited. They have quite a few nice field guides there where you can look at them and touch and feel them. Also, the Book Bin has quite a few of them. If you ever get the chance and it opens up, go to the Portland Audubon. They have thousands of books. And so at that point, the bottom line, the bird guide needs to fit your needs and your preference. So with that, I'll stop the share. We can take some questions.
We do have one question, Mike. Flo asks about which bird you were discussing had the better bird song description.
Okay. Yeah, the one I think that has the best is the Sibley guide, like the Sibley Birds of the West one, for example. There we go. Birds of the West book. And it has some pretty good ones.
Now, Mike makes a good point. Sibley has various guides, and he's got the big guide, which has all of North America, and then he's got the Eastern and Western guide, and they have different information. And so you might like the Western guide better because it seems to have more focus on the Western birds, including better song descriptions, better range maps, more photos on Western birds than the big book would have.
Yeah. And let's see, Peterson Field Guide to Birds. Let's see here. It gives a pretty good description of the voice. And that's this one here. It's fairly new too. It just came out very recently. I don't see the date on here, but oh, here we go. 2020, so it's fairly recent. Let me take a look here at the guide, the National Geographic Guide to Birds is another good one. And this is where I was talking about, you can see the little places for the thumb here, and it's basically divided up to sandpipers, gulls, hawks, flycatchers, thrushes, warblers, and sparrows. Very nice little fingers things here. So I go to flycatchers here, put my thumb there and open up and write to flycatchers here. So I really like that about the National Geographic thing. Also, National Geographic has a quick find guide like somebody was mentioning early. And in the front, it has a visual index of bird families and tells you what pages those are on. For example, ducks, geese, and swans are on pages 14 through 53. Say one of these tabs wasn't on something, for example, I want to find oyster catchers. Well, it's on page 114 through 115.
Another thing I like about National Geographic is a lot of their range maps have the subspecies broken down. They do the best job, I think, on that. So if you're looking for dusky Canada goose, which is our protected species here in Oregon, and is what the refuges were set up to support, it'll actually give you range maps for that subspecies of the Canada goose.
Yeah, in fact, I'm just looking through the guide here. It, generally speaking, it gives a very nice calls and song descriptions in here. It might be just as good as Sibley, to tell you the truth.
I think where Sibley shines
wrong.
on those plates that he does. He just does a fabulous job on his plates with every, with a plate on a lot of different mulks, age, and gender differences in the birds. And plus he's got plates on flight. He does an outstanding job on his drawings.
Yeah, and there's a good front part of the book too on how to look at things, and each book covers something different. This one even covers banding code, for example, but and it goes through how to, I like, how to identify birds, and talks about the different things that, I've already discussed. But I really like this field guide, and the 7th edition is the most current one. So any other questions? So, okay, let's see if I have anything else we've covered. Like we said, the bottom line is choose a guide that fits your needs and preference. Just like with OPIC, everyone is different. So look at several guides and you compare them. And like I said earlier, check like a robin or red-tailed hawk or another bird, and compare how each guide handles the coverage of those birds. And so you have a direct comparison there. So I'm going to share my screen one more time here. Just show you the next webinar is Where to Go Birding in June. It's another free webinar, May 27th at 2 p.m. I won't be doing any webinars in June. I'm going to take a month off, but hopefully we'll return in July or August.
And then we have beginning birding webinars in May that Maureen and Nick are going to offer. And that should be good whether or not you're new to birding. They'll do a nice comprehensive review of birding, ID, birds in our area, other things that could be of interest. There's a small fee for that, $8, but I suggest you take a look at that.
Yeah, good point. You can go to SalemAudubon.org, our website, to sign up for any of these classes.
And there's a description there under the upcoming events that will tell you what they're going to cover in those 2 sessions. You can sign up for them individually or together.
Okay, and last call for any questions. Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending, and get out there and enjoy the good weather that's coming up after the next 3 days, and get out there and go birding and put some of these tips to use. So at this point, I'll go ahead and end. And
thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
See you next time, Annette.
I want to talk to you. Can you hold on for a minute after we say goodbye?
Sure. I'll just stop. Can you stop the recording?